Hello everyone, it's me again. My name is Trang and I'm a postgraduate researcher at NTU. And welcome to the fourth panel of the Building Bridges Conference on Environmentalism, Conservation and Decolonisation. So we have four speakers for today's panel. Our first is Badakynti Nylla Iangngap with a presentation titled Reappropriating Folklore, Identity and Ecological Concerns of Contemporary Khasi Literature. Badakynti is currently pursuing a Ph.D. at Northeastern Hill University, Shillong in India. She gained interest in postcolonial studies during her MA and M.Phil at the University of Delhi, with specific interest in the literature of her Buddha community. She has also taught at Kalindi College, University of Delhi, before moving to Shillong to teach at Synod College. Our second speaker is Dr. Catherine Price, who will be talking about climate change and just futures, a case study of biochar and soil. Catherine is a research fellow in the School of Geography at the University of Nottingham. She's currently working on the interdisciplinary biochar demonstrator project, which is addressing the key deployment barriers of biochar for carbon sequestration. The focus of this work is stakeholder perspectives and deliberative democracy. Her research interests include the relationship between humans and the more than human world, the environment, agricultural technology adoption, and the social and ethical impacts of agricultural technologies. Our third speaker is Dr. Shahid Abdullah with a presentation titled Resisting Environmental Destruction and Fighting Socio-Political Marginalisation in Hawaii in Kiana Davenport Strap Dialogues. He's currently an assistant professor in English at East West University of Bangladesh. His research interests include trauma, alienation, memory, identity, marginalisation, postcolonialism, eroticism, and magical realism. His first book, Traumatic Experience and Repressed Memory in Magical Realist Novels, Speaking the Unspeakable, was published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing in 2020. Our last speakers are Swapnit Pradhan and Dr. Nagendra Kumar with a presentation titled From Preservation to Persecution, Unbuilding Universal Norms of Environmentalism in Amitav, Ghosh, The Hungry Tide. Swapnit is a research scholar in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Roorkee in India. He has completed his master's in English literature and language from Central University of Orissa, and his areas of interest are the intersections of literature and ecology, cultural studies, and Indian literature in English. Dr. Nagendra Kumar is a professor in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department in IIT Roorkee, India. He has an ongoing career as a teacher and mentor lasting over 25 years. One of the many awards that he was conferred with was the Merit Scholarship by the Government of India. His areas of research or interest are South Asian literature, modern literature, contemporary fiction and critical theories, Indian writing, soft skills, communication skills, Indian diaspora, Dalit studies, and postcolonial literature. So as usual, please submit your question to us using the YouTube live chat or email them to us at buildingbridges@ntu.ac.uk. We hope we can have a lively discussion afterwards. So over to our first speaker to start us off.
Hello, my name is Badakynti Nylla Iangngap. I'm a Ph.D. scholar from the Department of English, Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, India. The topic of my presentation today is Reappropriating Folklore, Identity and Ecological Concerns of Contemporary Khasi Literature. Before I begin, I'd like to clarify that I'm using the term appropriating here, not as a politicized term as it has become today, but merely for grammatical usage. So without further ado, I begin my presentation. The Khasis are a tribe in Northeast India who inhabit the Khasi Jantia Hills. The Khasis actually include the Kinriam, Panar, Bhoiwar, Maram, Lingam, and Diko. The Khasis were an oral-based community and they organized their folk knowledge in either non-verbal or verbal forms. The coming of the missionaries changed all of that. The Khasi language was transcribed, and this transcription was completed in 1842. And Khasi literature in its initial years was developed by resident missionaries. The written literature of the Khasis, that is literature written by a Khasi, only saw light during the late 19th century. And the trend of early Khasi writers was transcription of folk tales and the writing of short stories and anecdotes that reflected the indigenous life worlds of the Khasis. More than 50 years later, Khasi literature today is rich in its content with the folk tradition still making its presence felt. Contemporary writers like Estes Aim, Kinpam Singh Nongkanri, Janice Bariat, K.K. Karluki are widely influenced by Khasi folk tradition. And their use of the folk is not a mere romanticization, nor is it a mere recapitulation of an age gone by, but it is a means of reconnecting with their identity. These are the objectives of my paper. I will be dealing with two texts, K.K. Karluki's Tears of the Nymph and Aim's Memoir in Water, Speaks the Wa'unkra. I'll talk about the framework that I am reading these two texts in, okay? While nature has been a subject of literature since time immemorial, a formal critical engagement with the relationship between nature and literature is fairly new, dating back to the 1990s with William Ruckert in Literature and Ecology and Experiment in Eco-Criticism. A clear-cut definition, I'd like to argue, of eco-criticism would be difficult because of its interdisciplinarity. But a general understanding is that it is a cultural and literary theoretical approach where literature, culture, and the physical environment meet to study the environmental crisis that has become characteristic of our age. Eco-criticism takes an earth-centered approach rather than an anthropomorphic approach. Focusing more on the physical environment does not exclude the human entity. For this approach relies on human activism as a productive means of engaging environmental crisis, a crisis which is also a result of human activity. Though eco-criticism is more earth-centered than human-centered, it nevertheless helps in situating the human's place in this new ecological matrix. The humanist understanding of man's centrality is put to question and overhauled as he fails to carry out his own social responsibility towards his surroundings. The eco-consciousness of the Khasis is also obvious in their folklore and especially their creation myths. And I'd like to indulge in a little bit of storytelling here. I'd be taking into account two creation myths, Sopet Beneng myth and Dingye myth. The Sopet Beneng myth is about the arrival of man into the world. The earth pleaded with the creator to send guardians and stewards to take care of it. And so the creator sends 7 clans to the earth, and they were to remain on earth, and they were to live in perfect harmony with nature. A covenant was made that man would always have God's favor if he followed the 3 tenets, which include, number 1, to know man, to know God, number 2, to know one's paternal and maternal relations, and number 3, to earn one's righteousness. A tangible sign of this covenant is when God planted a tree called the Dingye tree, which acted as a ladder between heaven and earth. Man lived in the golden age. He lived in abundance and in harmony with nature. The second part of the myth, which is considered the Dingye myth, tells us that soon man strayed from his tenets, and God saw that the golden age must end. So the tree that was a sign of God's promise took a menacing turn. It branched out and covered the whole world in darkness. And panic-stricken, man decided to cut the tree down. They chopped and they hacked from dusk to dawn, but somehow the tree would be whole again the next day. And dumbfounded, they repeat this over and over again. One day, a small bird called the Pred came to visit the men, and seeing their predicament, asked them to make a promise to go back to obeying God's 3 tenets. And it is only then that she will tell the secret of the tree's healing. And she tells them that it is the tiger who comes tonight to lick the wounds of the trees. And so, along with the bird, the men planned to fortify the trunk with knives and axes. The next day they came back to the site and they saw blood everywhere. The tiger had cut his tongue and he had fled. With the tiger out of the way, the Dingye is finally felled and the darkness is also dispelled. The colonial undertones of exploitation cannot be ignored in the case of the original settlers, the 7 clans. Subsequently, the Dingye situation is a result of failure to manage natural resources freely given by the creator, a failure to follow the social principles of the 3 tenets, which results which resulted to catastrophic environmental issues. What becomes obvious from these myths is man's well-being is intricately linked to the well-being of nature. It is his misplaced centrality that led to the predicament of darkness and chaos. And it is only when he takes social responsibility towards his surrounding that balance is once again restored. Now I'll go to the text that I'll be doing. The prologue of Memoir on Water reads, I know you've never really needed me. None of you have had any use for me. It is always I who came to you, I who offered you my soul, I who gave you my being. Here, Aim employs the trope of the testimonial. And again, in the prologue, the river says, these stories have to be told. They're not what you'd want to hear, not what you'd expect to hear, but what you have to hear. As testimonial, Aim's novel allows the river to be the witness of the changes that were happening around it. And rather than being the backdrop for human action, nature in Memoir on Water becomes a subject given a voice to speak. But even with subjectivity, the river cannot go beyond its non-human form and admits to its limitation when it says, I was powerless, condemned only to watching, condemned only to flow with the tide. An important trope that Aim uses is the feminization of the female, of the river. And this is intentional on the part of the author because it is Aim's way of engaging, eco-feminist way of engaging with nature and with literature. It is the kind of ecofeminism that is espoused by Greta Garde and Patrick D. Murphy, who says that the recognition of connections between exploitation of nature and the oppression of women across patriarchal societies, but on the recognition that these two forms of domination are bound up by with class exploitation, racism, colonialism, and neocolonialism. The use of Khasi, of the Khasi myth, Ngat Puri, is seen in Aim's text as well. Puri are magical creatures of the female sex, and they were infamous for bewitching men with their supernatural beauty and powers. Folklorist Desmond Karmoplang makes a sizable collection of such tales of Ngat Puri, or bewitched by the nymph, okay? And he points out that this phenomenon is a very old one. But the coinage was only after Webster Davis used the term in his novel entitled Ngat Puri. So in the text, Kermenskem would go to the secluded coves of the river when life got too hard. And it was during such a time that a water nymph attracted to his heartache and conflict made her presence felt. The river narrates thus, so from dream to reality is but a short step, I would say. The nymph had shed all timidity and had in turn won his trust. He lived a parallel life during the day. And during the day he worked in the human world, and at night he would be living in the water world of the nymphs. And it is here that he received a love never shown to him before. However, his story was deemed to be a tragedy. As his children grew up and started asking about his world, he felt that it is best that his parallel worlds came together. But while his human family tried their best to accommodate his Puri family, their efforts are in vain, for the human ways are unaccommodating to the ways of these creatures. His wife flees from the house because the mother itched to clean the house with a sinsar or a broom, which was considered a taboo for the nymphs, and his children, whose avatar in the human world are butterflies, are senselessly and violently killed by his mother, who thought of them as nothing but a nuisance. It is an end that is predetermined by mankind's selfish ways, and that is usually never conducive to the environment and to nature and its creatures at large. Overall, the stories of this novel are eyewitness accounts of the degradation of man that is mirrored in the degradation of the river, which is a result of man's selfish and sometimes ignorant but destructive ways. I'll go next to the other novel. Tears of the Nymph can be read as the author's engagement with the threat on Khasi indigenous folk life, not merely in terms of the popular debate of the oral versus the written, but a threat that affects the indigenous life worlds of the folk tradition. Set in the post-colonial literate society that has moved away from the oral tradition, the novel traces the human processes of modernity that have made the folk and its life worlds redundant. Duncan moves to Disong, all right, with the intention to coexist with nature sustainably. But his arrival is transformed into a threat to the otherwise idyllic setting of Disong. The forces of modernity, money, greed, exploitation, natural resources follow him to Disong and threaten the folk life there. His rationality also thwarts the folk belief system. He tries to rationalize folk belief system, and this is seen when Kron, his errand boy, tells him that a villager Jibor had taken up a nymph wife and is living in a dreamlike state. But of course, he rationalizes it as an illness. Similarly, when he sees a nymph, despite all of the telltale signs, he is unconvinced that it really happened. For him, the stories of Puris only existed as childhood stories told for entertainment. But for Kron, they were part of his indigenous life world. And it is only when Duncan embraces the indigenous knowledge later that he is able to resolve his conflicts and emerge a hero of the story. Here too, the novel uses the myth of Ngat Puri. Duncan's bewitchment by the Puri becomes a necessity, as the Puri and nature as a whole dive in a struggle for survival when human forces of greed and exploitation threaten their existence. The thick and vast Kulong forest becomes the battleground for their fight of survival. As pointed out by Miller, although some members of the human society tried to maintain the pristine conditions of nature-human interactions prescribed by indigenous knowledge, many began to believe that the alterations of nature is better for progressing civilization. The threat is embodied by Badin, who wants to cut down trees from the Kulong forest. The nymph's intuitive wisdom, that is a product of their years of observation and experience, sense this threat. So the queen makes a succinct sketch of human character, and she says, "Let me remind you again, we are dealing with human beings, the most feared, unscrupulous, and deceitful of all creatures that are adept to treachery, deception, and trickery, and they don't care who they hurt, as long as it serves their purposes or fetches them riches." When the nymphs initially send their emissary deity to plead with the owner to stop the felling of trees, Duncan breaks his promise and leashes out part of the forest to Badin. So it became an absolute necessity for deity to give up her world to be part of the human world by marrying Duncan, to ensure that the coexistence of man and nature is forever and inescapably linked. Yet deity's ultimate sacrifice is not enough, and it requires the sacrifice of their queen to pave way for deity's sacrifice. The continuity of life is thus ensured only after much of nature and what belongs to it has been lost. Both these novels should be analyzed within the larger framework of postcolonialism. Interpreting the use of folklore within the context of postcolonialism would reveal that the value systems that folklore espouse stand in stark contrast to those espoused by modernity that colonialism brought to the Khasi Hills. The epistemic violence of colonial intervention had caused a major rift in the indigenous knowledge systems of the Khasi, and this violence translates itself to actual violence that man who have lost their connection with the values of indigenous knowledge meets out senselessly upon nature because it is no longer in his value system. Miller notes that the Khasi perennial philosophy is an indication of visionary insight, and that it foresaw the necessity of effectively managing the most important issues confronting humanity: climate change, environmental challenges, and the need for sustainable approach. The climate change and the environmental challenge is a result of mismanagement of man and natural resources in the case of the creation myths that I talked about earlier. The two novels offer a preview of the two opposite outcomes. While Memoir on Water points to the tragedy that awaits man and nature because of the imbalance and excess between nature and man, Tears of the Nymph shows outcome that can be achieved if man and nature lived in harmony. Herman, the product of marriage between man and nature, becomes symbolic of the hope that exists for mankind if he takes his social responsibility towards his environment seriously. And with that, I end my presentation, and I hope that it was useful to you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. Today I'm going to be talking about Climate Change and Just Futures, a case study of biochar and soil. So one approach to tackling anthropogenic climate change is through greenhouse gas removal technologies. These greenhouse gas removal technologies encompass a suite of technological fixes aimed at removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And one technology which can potentially remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is biochar. So in this presentation today, I'll first introduce biochar. I'll then discuss the term just transition and explain cosmopolitan justice. And I'll briefly explain the methods used in the study so far before discussing the findings. And the findings will focus on the benefits of biochar and the cosmopolitan injustice associated with biochar. So to limit the increase in global mean temperatures to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, the Royal Society and Royal Academy of Engineering integrated assessment models estimate the greenhouse gas removal, GGR, by 2100 must equate to 230 gigatons of carbon. And to put this into context, a gigaton is the equivalent to 200 million elephants. In order for the UK to reach net zero by 2050, which is the UK government's target, greenhouse gas removal technologies will need to be removing and storing 35 megatons of carbon a year. So biochar is a greenhouse gas removal technology that could potentially contribute to reaching the UK government's net zero target. So what is biochar? So biochar is a carbon-rich substance produced by a thermochemical process called pyrolysis. And pyrolysis is a thermal decomposition of biomass which occurs at a very high temperature and under oxygen-deprived conditions. And three byproducts are produced: biochar, which is a solid, bio-oil, which is a liquid, and syngas, which is a gas. And the term biochar appears to have been coined at the 2006 Pennsylvania Soil Conference, where it was a topic of discussion. And whilst biochar seems a relatively new material, it has a long and complex history. And biochar is related to terra pretas, otherwise known as the Amazonian dark earths. And these soils are small areas, around 2 to 20 hectares, in the lowland regions of Amazonia, which contain large amounts of black carbon from the incomplete combustion of organic materials. And terra pretas are not natural, but were formed through human intervention. Indigenous people burnt wood in hearths, and the carbonised remains were applied to soils, enabling the terra pretas to form. And attempts to recreate terra preta led to the Terra Preta Nova project in 2002, and to the commercialisation of terra preta. And Terra Preta Nova is an artificially produced soil which can be produced anywhere in the world through a technical process. And Terra Preta Nova became connected to the idea of climate change mitigation and sustainable development, and moved the benefits of carbon sequestration and soil fertility from a local scale to a global focus. And from 2006, the focus shifted from Terra Preta Nova to biochar. So biochar can be produced from agricultural and forestry wastes, and this can be then applied to soils. And it's potentially a means of sequestering or locking up carbon for thousands of years, thereby removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It can also act as a soil conditioner, by increasing the pH of acidic soils, and it can also improve the water holding capacity of soil. And biochar can also modify the nutrient exchange between plants and soil, along with improving soil aeration and structure, especially in very heavy soils. And these properties are beneficial to plant health. So the project I'm involved with is an interdisciplinary demonstration programme, which is investigating the application of biochar to arable fields, grasslands, woodland and contaminated land here in the UK. And I'm involved with the social science aspect of the project, which is investigating the stakeholder perspectives and understandings of biochar. And with this part of the project, we're examining the possibility of biochar contributing to a just transition to net zero. So the term just transition emerged from global trade unions in the 1970s. And although there is variability in its translation, a just transition is attentive to and seeks to address justice dimensions of a chosen transition pathway. And according to Macaulay and Heffron, they define the just transition as, and I quote, a fair and equitable process of moving towards a post-carbon society. This process must seek fairness and equity with regards to the major global justice concerns, such as, but not limited to, ethnicity, income, gender, within both developed and developing contexts. And by its very nature, this transition must take place at a global scale, whilst connecting effectively with multi-scalar realities. And it involves the development of principles, tools and agreements that ensure both a fair and equitable transition for all individuals and communities. So in the literature, the argument is made for just transitions to focus on climate justice, energy justice and environmental justice. However, this often tends to focus only on the human elements of justice. And I'd argue that this needs to go further and also include justice for the more than human world too. So an unjust transition will be focused on scientific and technological innovations with the aim of repairing planetary systems, including ecosystems, without addressing the power and wealth associated with the rich and the super rich. And technologies are being developed by the same countries and for the same corporate beneficiaries who have and continue to benefit from the structures of power and wealth which have contributed to climate change. And low-tech solutions, which are less patentable and less profitable, may be more sustainable, but these are often overlooked and the focus remains on high-tech solutions. And high-tech solutions often overlook the social changes which are required. So although this presentation focuses on the injustices associated with cosmopolitan justice, I just wish to mention that this is a part of a larger stakeholder mapping study. And this larger study also focuses on distributive injustices, procedural injustices, and recognition injustice. So what is cosmopolitan justice? So cosmopolitan justice means that all humans are bound and protected by moral principles, have an equal moral worth regardless of gender, ethnicity, or class. All humans are treated equally and focuses on individual well-being as opposed to communities or nations. However, considering cosmopolitan justice like this seems insufficient. And because of this, there's been a favouring of white privilege, and humans who have been devalued as less than human have been treated as expendable, along with animals, plants, microbes, fungi, and non-living entities such as soil and water. And I'd argue that cosmopolitan justice also needs to encompass multi-species justice. And Brandon Jones defines multi-species justice as, and I quote, a politics for composing a common world that considers the needs and livelihoods of a diversity of human and non-human life, close quote. So multi-species justice is not about attaining justice for humans and then turning attention to the more than human world. Instead, it's about considering the issues of justice, harm and reconciliation as entangled across humans and the more than human world. And the idea is creating a just world for living and non-living entities. And justice shifts from the individual and the exceptional human to both living and non-living entities and their interactions and entanglements. And there are already a number of scholars who are arguing for justice to be addressed through a multi-species lens, such as Daniel Selamaja, Donna Haraway, Sophie Chow, and Debolina Roy. So just briefly explain the methods. So the stakeholders have been identified in a number of ways. We've got stakeholders who are members of the expert advisory group of our project. We've used opportunistic sampling, and so stakeholders are identified through Twitter, through the announcement of the release of reports, and those also identified by other stakeholders. We've also used Google to identify stakeholders, search terms including biochar and UK agriculture, net zero and UK agriculture, and UK and biochar. And we've also used stakeholders who we've identified through the literature review and also contacts from previous projects. So once our stakeholders are identified, individual websites were checked for any documents or reports relating to biochar that have been released by these stakeholders. And individual websites were then searched using the term biochar, and we were able to identify 36 items. So our stakeholder mapping encompassed descriptive characteristics of our stakeholders and the documents, the identification of any benefits and concerns of biochar, and any mention of a transition to net zero or a just transition. And so once these benefits and concerns and any mention of a transition or just transition were identified, these were coded in relation to the different types of justice, these being distributive, procedural, cosmopolitan, and recognition. So we identified 29 benefits of biochar, and this slide shows a selection of these. And 7 of these benefits focus on improvements, improved soil fertility and quality, improved soil health and structure, improved soil pH, improved habitat for soil microbes, improved plant health and growth, improved drainage in soil, and improved aeration in soil. And 3 of these benefits also focus on an increase, such as increased soil water capacity, increased nutrient content, and increased fertiliser efficiency. So biochar is also put forward as an approach that can help reduce pollution and also have positive impacts on animal health. And so the benefits show the addition of biochar is improving the condition of soil. And many farmers are living under the pressures of productionism, and the requirement is to produce as much food as possible from the land. And the terms improvement or increase, which are viewed as benefits, all derive essentially from scientific knowledge production. And certainly with the scientific community in agriculture, it's often about improvements such as improved genetics for breeding farm animals or improved plant crop breeding for increased yields. And in this productionist frame, soil care is about increasing soil's efficiency to produce food for humans, and soil is a function or service for humans. However, there's a contradiction here. And if you consider the benefits from the perspective of a farmer, they can be forms of justice, especially with caring for soil. And there are many farmers wanting to work with soil ecosystems rather than against them as part of desirable farming systems. So seeing these benefits of biochar as improvements are issues of justice if a farmer is acting with care towards soil. And a farmer will not do anything to actively harm what is important to their farm business. So the cosmopolitan justices associated with biochar arise from the knowledge and understanding of farmers rather than from scientific knowledge. But it's our everyday practices and working with soil which enables these justices to arise. So 10 issues of cosmopolitan injustice were identified with biochar, and these focus on the harms biochar may cause to soil, including elevated salt levels, elevated pH levels, the immobilisation of nitrogen, a decrease in soil carbon, and the uncertainty of biochar on soil productivity. So biochar may darken soil and reduce the albedo, which means that it doesn't sequester much carbon and the heat can still escape to the atmosphere. And biochar could also break down and enter watercourses or into the atmosphere. So the long-term behaviour of biochar is not yet fully understood, and most biochar studies are only conducted in laboratories or in real-world conditions for 4 to 5 years. And there may also be unintended impacts on soil or water quality. So if you consider the cosmopolitan injustices associated with biochar, you can see how soil may be exploited, especially under the pressure of productionism. And soil is teeming with life. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes all live in soil alongside earthworms. And because the long-term behaviour of biochar is not yet understood, there is no real understanding of what will happen to the life found in soil. And soil may be harmed by the application of biochar. So including multi-species justice with cosmopolitan justice means that the entanglements between humans and biochar can be reconciled. Thinking about biochar through the lens of cosmopolitan injustice and multi-species injustice puts us on an altogether different course from the benefits of biochar. And the soil and all of the living entities found within it are considered just as important as humans. So considering the application of biochar as an issue of cosmopolitan injustice means acknowledging the harms that may be caused to soil and the bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes and earthworms which live within it. And once these harms are acknowledged, it's then possible to move forwards with an approach that helps build a just transition to a lower carbon society. So to finish, the benefits of biochar have been established through scientific studies. However, by only focusing on the science, innovation and progress, this emphasises who's leading the way. There is no sense of who is gaining or losing from the application of biochar. And this includes humans and the more than human world. And climate change does need to be addressed. It's not just a problem for the future, but is already impacting the world every day. And it would be wrong to just dismiss a potential solution such as biochar. So what we need is both science and other knowledge-making practices needing to be drawn upon to ensure that all voices are heard. And the possibilities of equality and justice are open up to humans and the more than human world as we move towards a post-carbon world. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
So hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. My name is Shahid Abdullah, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of English, East West University, Dhaka, Bangladesh. The title of my today's presentation is Resisting Environmental Destruction and Fighting Socio-Political Marginalization in Hawaii in Kiana Davenport's Shark Dialogues. So I'm not really using any slides, so I'll basically read out my paper. And I hope I'll be able to finish in 15 minutes. So let's get started. Kiana Davenport's 1994 novel, Shark Dialogues, emphasizes the role of memory in creating alternative realities, restoring the process of cultural memory and thus reconstructing social identity distorted by a colonial role. By including Hawaiian women with complex identities as having strong role in the history of the nation and describing their participation for the well-being of the descendants, Davenport attempts to investigate the colonial and neo-colonial history of Hawaii. By linking bodies, lands, and languages, she attempts to establish a relationship of women with social, cultural, and political framework and resistance against environmental destruction with battle against socio-political marginalization. Davenport takes a brave and ambitious attempt of redefining Hawaiian history from a Hawaiian, particularly female Hawaiian perspective. It is thus through female voices and bodies that the history of violence on and abuse of women is described. The brutality against Hawaiian women and the destruction of environment, both of which are interrelated, opens up the multiple history of a huge cultural dispossession suffered by Hawaiian people. It is through the character of Pono and her ability as a kahuna to remember her ancestors, Davenport attempts to record the initiation of colonization in Hawaii until the way it is described in the present day by including more recent issues where the vast wealth of Hawaii was considered a mere commodity for the colonizers to be exploited to benefit the metropolitan areas. The US ecological imperialism has a widespread consequences on the Hawaiians, displacing them from their ancestral living environment. Although the land itself is returned through the abolishment of Great Mahele, reconciliation with the past living of indigenous Hawaiians proved to be impossible. Honolulu, the capital of Hawaii, turns into a luxurious Western city and becomes a symbol of American colonization in Hawaii. And Shark Dialogues the novel severely criticizes what colonialism and neocolonialism have done to the native people. I mean, the destructive outcomes of the Pearl Harbor attack, the forced recruitment of Hawaiian men in the Vietnam War, and the risky decision to tackle the white supremacy through the terrorist activities. The narrative moves back and forth in time and from the historical to a fictional level, creating a sort of non-linearity, which helps the formation of characters in their private domain. Official history thus becomes personal and subjective, giving a chance to characters to place them in historical timeline and to reinterpret history itself. In the novel, family history thus parallels the history of Hawaiian colonialism. From the moment of the initial meeting between Kalonikoa and Matisse, which takes place in the moment of history when Hawaii gets colonized by the whites, Davenport records all the historical moments, the loss of land, wiping out of Hawaiian population due to the spread of Western diseases, the US annexation of Hawaii, the removal of Queen Liliuokalani, I guess I pronounced it correctly, the effect of Pearl Harbor and the Second World War, ecological imperialism, nuclear pollution, and so on, from the viewpoint of the colonial victims. Coming to visit the island, US President Franklin Roosevelt wished to see an example of the, I quote, island's majestic aborigines, a stately reminder of what Hawaiians had once been, unquote. Fully realizing the outcomes of colonial history, Pono, the protagonist, says, I quote, "That's how they see us. Porters, servants, hula dancers, clowns, they never see us as we are, complex, ambiguous, inspired humans," unquote. Dominant colonial culture portrayed the Hawaiians as a romantic, disappearing race to be extinct by the modern development, and their culture has been stereotyped for the tourist enjoyment. Riemstedt argues that the state and the dominant group or culture have the power to manipulate the past, to utilize the present for their benefits, and it is thus the task of the marginalized, I quote, groups or individuals to construct counter-memory to oppose state control, unquote, which will definitely challenge colonial authority. Davenport's historical treatment of Hawaii forces the reader to face the colonial history not from the standpoint of the victimizers, but from the victims. The arrival of the first group of colonizers in Hawaii and later the Christian missionaries brought a devastating cluster of events, forcing the native people to drastically change their social and spiritual relationship patterns and thus almost destroying Hawaiian culture. Apart from the dislocation and cultural degradation of Hawaiians, the arrival of the sailors also brought various diseases to the island, which removed a large portion of the population. I quote, "Their bodies carried sailor's pox, always fatal to natives. They were spreading it island to island as a way of conquering the Pacific," unquote. Apart from placing history within the historical context of Hawaii and highlighting the significance of redefining the role of native in post-colonial discourse, Davenport quite visibly explores the essential connection between women and nature, giving women a voice and consciousness which has the ability to knock down male dominance and foresee a world without female oppression. The novel demonstrates the way its characters identify and manipulate history. Thus, the history depicted from the viewpoints of Hawaiian women is an alternative and hotspot one, which interweaves the past, present, and future, and where their identities are constantly shifting. Davenport constantly points to the gap between the way non-Hawaiians see Hawaii and Hawaiians and non-Hawaiians see Hawaii and Hawaiians. And Hawaiians, both insiders and outsiders, see Hawaii from the shore. I mean, the way outsiders see Hawaii and the way Hawaiians who are living inside Hawaii and outside Hawaii see themselves. or see the Hawaii. Davenport writes about Jess. I quote, "Living here now, she saw in the papers and on TV tragedies that never reached mainland America," unquote. And I quote, "She felt herself slipping into pidgin, which always made talk more intimate and real," unquote. Pono is a kahuna, a shaman, and a healer possessing magical connection with nature, who holds out her arms reciting, and I quote, "Wild boar in the jungle went down on their knees. When she sang, flowers changed color, spotted deer dissolved into the bark of trees as hunters passed with bow and arrow," unquote. As a shaman, Pono has the ability to peer into the lives of her ancestor, a white person named Matthis Conradson, as her great-grandfather. Pono's grandmother Emma, and her maternal lineage from Lily. Since Pono possesses a spiritual connection with nature and landscape of Hawaii, she is tremendously afflicted at its destruction. Sometimes she hears the land scream in horror. I quote, "Aina, Aina, the land, unquote. As Pono considers it her own responsibility to save her land and culture, she vehemently protests the disrespect of American government in their plan to establish power plants just above the ancient graveyards of local Hawaiian ancestors. As Pono explained that the government has a plan to, I quote, "raise this rainforest of old kua trees, build 5 power plants over ancient burial shrines, have the holy trees splintered into wood chips, burned to generate further electricity, construct a huge spaceport on the grounds of our ancestors, and establish a $900 million Riviera resort, which will kill off everything this side of the island," unquote. These acts illustrate the lack of respect the American has towards nature and the presence of sacred ground, as they merely consider the necessity of land clearing in order to construct power plants for electrical usage. The social and political issues analyzed by Davenport in her narrative are continuously arbitrated through the human body as metaphor, and therefore there is an employment of corporeal symbolism. According to Rocha, I guess it's Rocha, R-O-C-H-A, the critic. On the one hand, an extended interrogation of Western construction of the female exotic body are offered in Davenport's text, and on the other, she uses the human body as a vehicle for presenting new conceptualizations of the position of women in a contemporary Hawaiian society, unquote. Humiwawa identifies the bodily standard upon which the formation of otherness depends within the colonial backdrop. It also provides the connection between sexual craving and desire for dominance. Julia Kristeva argues that the conservation of the symbolic order, referring to both individual personality or identity and social system, require some sort of division of, I quote, clean and proper body, unquote. Kristeva's notions of the contrast between impure bodies and socially appropriate bodies can be a suitable means to explore the response to decay or corruption in Hawaii. Although in most of the cases, it is woman who is depicted as abject or impure. In Shark dialogue, it is a male body, Duke's body, which is discussed. Davenport symbolically extends the issue that leprosy describes the humiliation of the nation, the destruction of law and order induced by contamination and corruption accompanied with colonialism. Duke's body is ultimately colonized and contorted by a Western disease, which slowly turns him into an abject person. The fact that Pono tries hard to contract the disease in order to be taken to the island where lepers are used in medical research, but is proved immune to it, turns the gender hierarchy upside down, placing women in a more privileged position than men. Davenport, I guess that's the last This is a concluding part of my presentation. Davenport finishes the novel with the Hawaiian word imua, meaning hope, conveying some sort of optimism and tolerance. Although people have torn and hybrid identities, she attempts to emphasize the necessity of equilibrium among people. Despite the notion of problematic heterosexuality, Duke and Pono foster the metaphor of gods Ku and Hina, as Martha Beckwith asserts, I quote, Ku and Hina, male or husband, and female or wife, are invoked as great ancestral gods of heaven and earth, who have general control over the fruitfulness of earth and the generations of mankind. Together, the two include the whole earth and the heavens from east to west in a symbol that also they can include the generations of mankind, both those who are to come and those who already born, unquote. In spite of containing potentially controversial aspects, Beckwith provides a clear and logical explanation of Hawaiian gods and goddesses, traditions and rituals, which can be symbolically applied to Davenport's portrayal of her characters, which is evident in their mysterious disappearance into the ocean, as though they were arriving home in a broader sense, and their empowering relationship with their surrounding people. When the narrative describes Pono's journeys into the hinterland and the entire family histories, and ultimately focuses on female bodies and their memories, it creates a web of polyphonic narrative which echoes through the text and adds potency to Pono's narrative, as well as to her version of the history of Hawaii. So that was all from me. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Swapnit Pradhan, research scholar working in IIT Roorkee. And for this conference, I'll be presenting this paper titled From Preservation to Persecution, Unbuilding Universal Norms of Environmentalism in Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide. These are the contents. To quote Arundhati Roy, she says, I think of globalization like a light which shines brighter and brighter on a few people, and the rest are in darkness, wiped out. They simply can't be seen. Once they get used to not seeing something, then slowly it's no longer possible to see it. Introduction. So mainstream environmentalism, its primary focus is on preserving pristine landscapes. So it tends to defend militantly the Mother Earth. So what happens is this instigates a deliberate isolation of human from non-human. It can be seen in the 1964 Wilderness Act put forth by the American government. A wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. So this Eurocentric environmental vision is based on the glorification of nature's aesthetic value. It sees nature as a place of recluse and relaxation. So the American invention of national parks and reserve forests, these are often funded by World Wildlife Fund and IUCN. What they do is they essentialize and reduce the topographical features and human nature interactions throughout the globe, especially in the global south. So ecological experiences in the south is primarily driven by aims of subsistence and survival. So Ramachandra Guha says the wholesale transfer of a movement culturally rooted in American conservation history can be problematic. What it does is it displaces and disposes people. Dean Curtin can be quoted. This is a neo-colonial attempt to enforce legal separation of tribes from their inhabited lands. Coming on to the novel that we will be discussing, The Hungry Tide. It's written by Amitav Ghosh in 2004. It is basically set in the Sundarbans. Sundarbans, it's situated in a remote corner in the eastern part of India. So The Hungry Tide, it presents a fictional account of the forcible evacuations in the wake of building a tiger reserve, which led to the gruesome Morijampi massacre. So the narrative can be seen through these characters. Firstly, Kanai, who represents the privileged outsider, which oblivious to the struggles and ethics of the local population. Then the events of the past are brought forth through the journal of Kanai's late uncle Nirmal. Then there is Pia Leroy, who is a rational researcher, who is willing to learn the socio-political and economic realities of the region. So rejecting the reductive vision of environment. So global North environmentalism, it follows this idiom that in nature it's an Eden too perfect for the fallen progeny of Adam and Eve. So Ghosh dismantles this romanticized perception of natural space. He shows that Sundarban is a place of epic mutability and severe complexity. Firstly, it is located on the very margin of India. He describes this in these terms. Sundarbans are the trailing threads of India's fabric, the ragged fringe of her sari. So he shows, Ghosh shows that Sundarban is not an idyllic space to be enjoyed, to be uh, treated as some place of recluse. Firstly, the geological obscurity of a tidal ecology is put forth. He showcases this: the tides reach as far as 300 kilometers inland. Every day, thousands of acres of forest disappear underwater. So he rejects this passive and benign portrayal of natural beauty, as there are frequent cyclones, storms, floods, famines, and so on. So human nature interaction, it's not based on just aesthetic appreciation, but filled with hardships that sustain their life. Uh, However, after all these hardships, there is this indelible human nature bond that can be seen here. The majority of population is directly or indirectly dependent upon the local ecology for their survival. They are so much embedded in their local ecology that they even identify themselves as the tide country people. This ethereal bond can be seen here. The rivers ran in our heads, the tides were in our blood. Not only this ethereal bond, but also the material bond can be seen where Fakir, Horen, Moina, and many other ecosystem people, they subsist through meager resources at their disposal. They do fishing, they collect forest produce. So this bond is broken, that leads to persecution of these people. Firstly, wilderness preservation is being seen as synonymous with environmentalism by the wealthy elites, and consequently environmental agendas of the southern nations are overlooked. There are resource shortages, pollution, soil erosion, all these are never addressed. So to the north, national parks, protected forests, these serve as indicators of ecological development in the southern nations. And in seeking their validation, the intricate human nature mess is broken, and hence human is isolated from the non-human. This inception of tiger reserve in the Sundarbans, it is also done through physical displacement of the earlier inhabitants of the region. So the cost of preserving one animal species is borne by a severely deprivileged lot. Okay, so Amitav Ghosh has written in this regard that over many decades, there has been a kind of ethnic cleansing of India's forest. Hence, these people become the disposable beings, people who are overlooked from the idea of nation making and development. They become what Rob Nixon calls surplus people, people removed and barred from space, evacuated from time and space. They are literally trucked away to concentration camps in Madhya Pradesh. They become nations' unimagined communities. However, in a desperate attempt to reshape their fates, these surplus people, they try to build a community on an island, Maurice, and the state in retaliation uses violence. And it was a matter of days, every trace of their existence was wiped off. These settlers, their lifestyles were declared unacceptable, irrational. The new colonial undertone can be seen here. They become uninhabitants, evacuated not only from land but also from public awareness. The militant attitude to protect land from men, rescuing land from indigenous people, these echoes of colonial legacy of Indian forestry. So these settlers were reduced to mere numbers, statistics, and denied even the bare minimum right to survive. The conservation policies were noble. However, the use of violence points towards a latent aggression beneath the good intention. So the use of violence was not only there, also in trying to separate human beings from their island, their basic rights are suppressed. Their forms of knowledge and production are rejected, and state takes over the meager resources that sustain their lives. This is what David Harvey terms accumulation by disposition. A character can be seen crying, Amra Kara, Bastuhara, who are we? We are the dispossessed. The loss of the land, resources beneath them, a loss that leaves communities stranded in place, stripped of the very characteristic that made it inhabitable. Rob Nixon had said this. So another facet of this poorly planned conservation program can be seen where the peculiarities of a tidal ecology are not considered while planning. There is this tiger and human conflict with the daily submersion of forest. The scent markings of the tigers are washed away. That leads to confusion, aggression, and it results in human casualties. This conflict is further fueled by the state's active privilege being vested on the welfare of the tigers, while they neglect the basic needs of human communities. These tigers become tourist tigers, what Anuj Elias calls tourist tigers. They move on to the other side of overarching status division, and therefore were no longer protected by the islanders, but started being attacked when they ventured into villages. Hence, the very purpose of the conservation program is compromised. Coming on to the practices of sustainability. So these totalizing reductive discourses of elite environmentalism, they discard the intimate knowledge of ecology and of the ethical beliefs of common people. Ramachandra Guha had said there are many agricultural communities. They do have a sophisticated knowledge of natural environment that may be equal and sometimes even surpass codified scientific knowledge. Such an instance can be seen for the indigenous population. Their affinity with nature can be seen through the numinous values of the Bon Bibi legend, which is culturally rooted in the Sundarbans. People adhere to the moral imperatives of this Bon Bibi legend to respect the boundaries of the forest, to place limits on their grid and not harm the sanctity of the forest in any way. They don't even spit, they don't put their belongings there, they don't harm the forest in any way. So these beliefs, so to say, the not disrespecting the ideals of Bon Bibi, this entitles that if they disrespect the Bon Bibi's legend, wrath would be brought about that would lead to their deaths by tiger attack or storms. And this belief is far more effective in conservation and placing limits on human greed when compared with any institutionalized set of instructions or fines. So in this legend, there is this embeddedness of non-human nature in human lives. So In Western mode of thought, animals are often treated as mere objects of study. But in this legend, Irrawaddy dolphins are considered to be the deity's messengers, and they are admired. Even while collecting crabs, prawns, the eggs are spared. Such ethical beliefs dictate a sustainable life. So, coming on to the central question, does environmentalism have to be anti-human in its approach? The Hungry Tide voices the social justice concerns springing from anti-human environmentalism. The two often sought, under the banner of universalism, to impose green agendas dominated by rich nations and Western NGOs. However, there is still a balance of portrayal between anthropocentric and ecocentric concern. Ghosh presents a scientifically accurate portrayal of tidal ecology. There is this instance of symbiotic potential between human animals, where dolphins help fakir in catching fish. Then, on not only the material value is given priority, also their ecological significance is highlighted. Wetlands, mangroves, these are highly valuable in terms of ecology. So, countering the popular environmental practices, Pia's brand of environmentalism is given. She presents a contrast to the notion that nature is best preserved in isolation from humanity. She is aware of material and cultural interests of the local population. She gives due respect to their intimate local wisdom. And as we have already seen, the myths and legends compel the people to live sustainably without harming the sanctity of the region. Anna Singh, she advocates this community-based conservation, where local population have a stake in conserving their surrounding ecosystems. Coming on to the conclusions. Firstly, there is this need to move beyond the blinkered conservation biology that views each non-human species in its own autonomous evolutionary space outside human histories. Then the imperial urban reductive vision of nature as a beautiful garden devoid of human presence and universalizing ecological experiences throughout the globe of human beings. These all need to be rectified. Often in India, human nature stay harmoniously in an organic entanglement, and a failure in providing stakes for these human beings and conserving the very environment that sustains them leads to alienation of humanity from nature, and the consequences, as we have already seen, are disastrous. Such exclusivist approach to conservation, this has to be rethought. The novel successfully captures the inconspicuous colonial practices of forestry, environmentalism, which promote ecological imperialism in the global south. Through Pia, the author seeks to bridge the gap between the anthropocentric ecocentric concerns. She gives due respect to local wisdom, considers the indigenous population as knowledgeable equals in the quest of preserving the environment. She substantiates that effective environmentalism doesn't have to be anti-human in its approach. So these are my references. Thank you.
Sorry. First of all, our presenters for your fascinating and very important presentations. There's lots of connection between the presentations as well. So we will move on to the Q&A session now, and we've got loads of questions from the audience, which is great. But I just thought to open up the discussion a little bit. I just want to sort of ask you to perhaps. Obviously, the conference focuses on building bridges and unbuilding bridges as well. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what sort of bridges you're building and unbuilding in your presentations, and perhaps also what sort of decolonial goals that you're working towards in your presentation.
Thank you, Trang, for opening up the discussion. I would like to answer that question from my side. So firstly, there is this need to build a bridge between the anthropocentric and ecocentric concern. Eco-criticism doesn't only mean we have to human aspect at my friend Badakynti said. To address the ecological issues, we also have to address the human issues that are intricately meshed with them. So firstly, there is this need to build a bridge between both these concerns, and in my paper, I have discussed that the efficient conservation programs don't need to leave out the human behind in order to conserve the nature. Yeah.
I think my presentation also does something similar to what Mr. Pradhan was saying. The bridging there is between the human centric and the earth centric, the eco and the anthropomorphic, because I think there needs to be a balance. Eco criticism, I mean, environmentalism is what it is today. It's under, our environment is under threat, not because of the environment itself, but because of what we humans have done to it. It's a crisis that humans are responsible for, and it's a crisis that only human activism can help solve. So yeah, I think that's the bridging that we're that both me and Mr. Pradhan are trying to to build there.
Yeah, I think there's probably two aspects to my paper. First of all, it's probably trying to bridge between the human and the more than human, and looking at the impacts of what the more than human world, what impacts humans have on the more than human world, and also trying to move away from this privilegisation of like secular science that Sophie was talking about this morning, and trying to move towards bringing in different types of knowledges, not just the Western view of science. So yeah, that's for my paper. That's where I was trying to come with building bridges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think in an age of climate change, there's just such an important need to build more connections between human and non-human life forms. So I'll move on to the audience question now, and we have a question for Badakynti. It's from Beth. So she asked, could you please talk a little more about what you mean by the trouble of the testimony?
Okay, so yeah, I've been trying to figure out what that meant, because I haven't located any trouble with the testimonial as a genre of literature, but I think what I meant there was the trope of the testimonial. In one of my books, Memoir in Water, uses the trope of the testimonial, in which the river acts as the witness, of the changes that are happening around it. In fact, she is personified, and the river is personified, and she's made into a feminine entity. And I think and as I read it, I recall the genre of the testimonial, that has been used by Latin Americans, especially in speaking about, the feminine witnessing of, atrocities, around them, and so that is why I've used the word testimonial there. I hope that answers Bet's question.
I'm sure it does, and I certainly agree. I think it's also a really important way of looking at testimony itself. The idea that not just humans can as well. They bear witness to what's going on literally within, their bodies. I have a question for Catherine from Valentina. So she said, thank you for an illuminating paper. And she asked, what other sciences and knowledge-making practices you are drawing from in your research to overcome the limits of a Western scientific paradigm? You're muted, Catherine.
Sorry. Thank you so much for that question. Yes, so for me, I use Debelina Roy's work a lot in my research, and she is somebody that is at the very forefront of science, but also draws very much on postcolonial work in her research. She's a molecular biologist, but draws on like feminist thinking. But also for me as well, I use Carl White's work a lot and Kim Tallbear, and both of them, they're working on the ideas and science. So they're forefront in like historical heritage, intellectual traditions, education practices and political advocacy, to investigate really how humans and the modern human world can live within like dynamic ecosystems. So, and they also bring to the fore like responsibility, justice and also spirituality. And for them it's ideas like thunder, rivers, stones, soil, rocks, all those sort of things are also brought into the thinking. And so that's very much where I'm thinking like with soil and care for soil, that's trying to bring their work in as well and dealing with that issue through. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think just hearing you talk now about the idea of the fact that you're dealing with soil and indigenous peoples have such deep connection with the soil and with the microbes and everything. And I think it's fascinating to engage with these indigenous voices. There's a question for Swapnit from Margaret. So she asked, she says, your paper rightly problematizes the universal application of environmental discourses constructed by dominant cultures. How can we ensure academic research and governmental policy to apply a bespoke approach?
Thank you, Margaret, for that question. You have rightly pointed out that universal application of environmental discourses can be disastrous. And in my paper, I have discussed this, so for a sparsely populated country, it is of not much concern to declare some area reserved only for non-human entities. And as we have seen, the consequences can be disastrous of applying all these morals in a universal manner. So what researchers can do is they can move beyond this Wordsworthian sense of preserving nature, of viewing nature as a benign beauty, of pastoral elegance. And what we can do is acknowledge the difference of interactions, difference of experiences of human nature interactions throughout the world. And government should do is acknowledge and give a stake to the indigenous population in preserving the very nature that have sustained them for generation. Having said this, it can also be argued that there are many communities who are responsible for and the harm caused to the environment around them, and there has to be a bridge between these concerns, that all the human-centric concerns cannot be given priority with sidelining the ecological concerns. And government have to in one of the papers there's this mention of community-based conservation. Anna Singh, she argues that local population can be reimagined as culturally marked and naturally wise. These morals can be included in government policies to apply this approach, and the approach should be in between. We cannot ignore the human concerns and to appease the Western patrons of environmentalism, as their experiences is far different from ours. I hope that answers this question.
Yes, I absolutely think so. I think there's, really important that we bring in different approaches to the environment rather than just sort of, one size fits all sort of approach to that, in order to ensure the multiplicities of, the flourishing of human and non-human life forms. So coming back to Badakynti, there's a question from Valentina. So she said, thank you so much, Badakynti, for a really interesting presentation. Can you tell us more about Khasi oral tradition, its protocols of reading and of telling and retelling, and also how contemporary writing exists in continuum with this tradition?
that's rather a very lengthy discussion, but okay, I'll just try to, answer that question. Khasi oral tradition, like any other oral traditions, existed prior to the written script, and for us, it was in 1842 that we had the written script. Prior to that, we only had the oral traditions, as a knowledge system, and so the oral tradition of the Khasis encapsulates the worldview of the Khasis. There are many, subgenres within the oral tradition. You have, subgenres of poetry. You have of, I would not call them epic exactly, but long narratives. You have, and the most famous being this subgenre of poetry called the power. Which is very much alive till today, and I think this will also answer your second question. It's used to now. It is now used as as a means of expression in Khasi rap music. It's also the traditional aspect of it is brought back to life by these local competitions in which people would participate, because it's it is a competitive. It's almost like slam poetry, but with a more competitive edge to it. So it works really well with that we have now. So yeah, there is a continuum, although I would say that there's also an evolution of how of how it is used. It is used now, and in terms of the protocols of telling and retelling, well, in terms of telling, it's the oral tradition is told by word of mouth from one generation to another. I know of stories of folk tales and folklores because of my grandfather and my grandmother, my dad, my mom sometimes, but mostly my grandparents. But within the Khasi oral tradition, in fact, it is the maternal uncle who plays an important role in the telling of Khasi folktales and folklore, because they are also prescriptive in nature. Some of the genres, and those are reserved only for the maternal uncle to recite. They are recited with ceremony, but some of them are used for entertainment purposes. And in terms of retelling, however, there's the medium of writing, and there's there's the digital, the audio, and the visual now that has been made available because of technology. And young Khasi storytellers are now telling folk tales and folk traditions through these various media of communication. And in terms of continuum, there's also continuum because contemporary writers now, like the ones that I've used, like this AMKK, Karluki, they've also incorporated elements of the oral tradition. They've also incorporated belief systems that are part of the oral tradition into modern genres of the novel form, for instance. So yeah, I hope that answers Valentina's questions.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating. Thanks so much for sharing. There's actually a follow-up question from Valentina, actually, but I imagine you already answered that. But I'm just going to read it out here to see if you have any to add. So she also asked, are tradition stories reimagined or adapted to contemporary context to express contemporary Khasi identity and struggle?
So, yeah, they have been reimagined. They have been readapted. Within the contemporary context, and the example of which I've given just now is the subgenre of poetry, the pawar. This is actually very interesting. It's also part of my PhD thesis, in fact, in which I talk about how the pawar now has been adapted by politics even, because it's used as a means of praising a politician, or rather degrading a politician, because it is a competitive, like I said, it is competitive poetry. There are two parties. One party is saying something else against the other party, and another party is saying something else against the other party. And so it becomes very interactive. With the local hip hop scene now, they've also used the genre of the power to sort of express, a very unique Khasi identity, to show that the power is uniquely Khasi. And so it's very interesting what contemporary times have adapted and reimagined this genre, especially. I think it's just in fact, it's just a Google search away if you see what the power means now and what the power meant then. It's truly evolved. Yeah.
Yes, I think that feeds back to what Sophie, I think, said this morning about this idea of indigenous knowledge and ways of living is not static, but actually changeable and changing and very much adaptive. So I have questions from Ashwarya for Swapnit. They say, thank you. Oh no, sorry, for Badakynti again. So they say, do ecological testimonies have any influence on environmental law and policy, and how do these texts achieve the performative and embodied liveliness of orality?
Okay, the first question, I wish they would have influence on environmental law and policy, but so far in my research, I haven't really come across something like that. So I'm afraid I cannot do justice to that question. But in terms of the texts that I'm dealing with, the performative aspect is seen in the way storytelling has been incorporated in both these texts, but especially Memoir in Water. If you come across Memoir in Water, you will see how the river in each chapter tells you about a different character, about the life of a different character as she follows this character. So it's a very personalized account of the characters in the text, and I think that that can be read as its performative aspect. And in terms of embodied liveness of orality, I would say that both these texts embody the indigenous worldviews of this community. So in that way, they embody the life worlds that each of the authors are trying to integrate into the larger framework of creative writing, of literature, and it's something that I think it is very important, because as I told you, our community, our tribe, is a very small tribe in India, in Northeast India. We are a minority tribe, and we are a scheduled tribe, and it's difficult when you are a minority and you're trying to assert your identity, and you're trying to put it out there, articulate it. These authors are trying to do then is that through their text, they're trying to express this idea of of life worlds that the Khasis inhabit, something that life worlds that are not necessarily so familiar within the larger Indian subcontinent, but which are very personal to them. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, that's some articulate answer to the question. We've got a few time for some more questions, I hope. So there's a question for Catherine. So from your presentation, biochar seems like an important alternative to tackle the urgent climate crisis. Can you reflect a little as to why this concept or method received adequate attention in the climate crisis discourse?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, and it's a really great question. I think so far at the moment, it has only been on a very small. It's used a lot in gardens, and it's garden centres sell a lot of it at the moment in little tubs, so you can use it on a small scale, but it's never actually been implemented on a large scale, which is what the project that I'm on at the moment. What we're actually looking at. I mean, it isn't into scientists and soil scientists working on it, engineers. So it's a big interdisciplinary team. And I think that's probably why so far it's used a lot in African countries. It's actually used as a way of enabling women in some of the African countries to actually earn a living by producing like these little briquettes. But I think that's probably why so far is that it's not on a large scale. Some of the other climate technologies like some of the geoengineering projects like carbon capture and storage and bioenergy capture and storage, they're more out there, and there's more, especially in like the IPCC report, which was like released yesterday. Biochar has only got a little mention compared to a lot of these other technologies. So I think probably the answer to that is because it's not been done on a large scale yet. So hopefully we'll see if it can be done.
I think there's a question for you as well, Catherine, that also quite links with that. The other question. So it's from Beth. So did you have any advice on what the arts and humanities might do to help such ecological realities as a knowledge-making practice working with literary, historical and cultural text?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it done in some other projects which have actually been really, really good with like arts-based projects. And the one I'm thinking of is one where they were looking at animal diseases in cattle, and they actually had different artists working with, I mean, this is in a UK context, but they actually had different artists working with farmers to produce, they actually produced drawings which actually ended up in an art gallery. So yeah, I think there is already work going on in that realm, and I think there's a lot that science can learn from the arts and humanities, especially through like creative practices. I mean, I've used some like visual methods myself, and it's just a way of coming in to like the topic from a bit of a different direction. But certainly like with the presentations that we've seen today, I think with like literary works, there's a way of actually bringing in people that might not necessarily engage with climate science, perhaps, for example, or biodiversity crisis. I think through literary text, you can actually get to an audience that might just disengage from looking at scientific like blogs or anything, even like the general more purposed literature. I certainly think literary texts are a way of reaching people that you wouldn't necessarily reach. So yeah, I think there's a lot that science can learn from the arts and humanities.
Yes, and I think that really echoes what about this intersectionality of different fields and area of studies that needed in order to sort of decolonize, but also to open up discussions from different perspectives.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are two questions for Swapnit. And one is from Valentina, so I should ask the first one, and the other one can feed into that. So Valentina said, thank you for an inspiring paper, Swapnit. The talk importantly tackles how elite environmentalism discuss indigenous knowledge about ecology and violate their rights. So she asked whether do you consider epistemic violence and injustice in your study as well?
Yeah, thank you, Valentina, for the question. Firstly, I'm sorry, I don't. I have not yet studied the aspect of epistemic violence in this regard. And secondly, yes, there's this injustice concern in my paper throughout. Firstly, the injustice it's not only secondary. The direct use of violence is there. In trying to isolate human from non-human entities, the state resorts to use violence, and they are treated as a form of human waste who should be properly disposed of. Otherwise, they can become hazardous. Yeah, and not only direct use of violence is there. In trying to isolate human from the nature, the control over resources is shifted from the poor peasants to the state uses it to uh, gain an edge in bringing up more economy. So the control over resources is there that causes injustice. And another aspect that I have not incorporated in this paper is the concept of environmental racism. So what it says is just this theorist Laura Pulido, she brings up this matter in her paper that communities which are non-whites and the non-white races are often treated as too poor to be mattered, and they should be kept in the vicinity of hazardous waste. They are treated as people who don't care enough about their ecology, and this side of injustice is also there. Yeah, in this paper I have brought up these two matters that in trying to apply the Eurocentric vision of environmentalism, uh, the people become eco refugees. Their claim to the resources that have sustained them through ages, it's taken out. And yeah, this addresses the injustice concern in my study.
And I think the next question sort of just builds up on what you just mentioned. So someone asked, can you speak a little about the historical context of petition and the refugee question, which the Hungry Tide deals with as are the important themes?
Yeah, as of now, I have not yet delved into that area of uh, citizenship and historical context of partition in this novel. Yeah, but I would like to address a different kind of citizenship that I have come across. The people inhabiting these regions, they don't identify themselves as a person from Bangladesh or a person from India. The person identifies himself or herself as a tied country people. Uh, he or she belongs to this tight country, this ecological citizenship, it's their identity. And the refugee question, yes, the partition took place in 1971, and they firstly these people fled from their homelands to the Sundarbans, and in building a tiger reserve, they were forced to evacuate that place again, and they were shifted to Madhya Pradesh. And from Madhya Pradesh, they fled again, came back to Sundarbans, and again they were separated from these homelands. So these are people who are not only displaced once or twice, they are thrice displaced people. So these refugees are there. And again ecological refugee concept is there, in trying to gain control over resources, control over the forest produces, the river produces that have sustained them from ages. They become ecological refugees. There's this term in my paper, Vastuhara. They not only their claim to the place is taken out, their claim to the resources is cut off. So yeah, they become refugee in these senses. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yes, I think we can wrap up here. Yeah, I think other discussions that bring together such importance of ideas about Indigenous knowledges, the role of their knowledges within, decolonising environmentalism and doing justice for non-human life form, was also the need to bring the human within our discussion of climate change in order not to, turn everyone into climate refugees. So yeah, once again, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and for sharing lots of interesting ideas. And before we go, I just want to say that there are two panels for tomorrow. One on decolonial research and pedagogy, and the other is on modernity and epistemology. And I hope I can see lots of you again tomorrow. So once again, thank you so much for being here.